However, more doctrinally knowledgeable anarchists understood that while Lenin agreed with them on the need for the insurrectionary overthrow of the bourgeois state, he still maintained, indeed emphasized, the Marxist program of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a transition to a fully communist society. In this regard, Rosner cites an imprisoned German anarchist, Erich Muhsan, writing in 1919, "The theoretical and practical thesis of Lenin on the accomplishments of the revolution and the communist tasks of the proletariat have provided a new basis for our action. There are no more insurmountable obstacles to a unification of the whole revolutionary proletariat. It is true that the communist anarchists have had to yield on the most important point of disagreement between the two great tendencies of socialism. They have had to abandon Bakunin's negative attitude to the dictatorship of the proletariat and accept Marx's opinion on this point." For Muhsan, the disagreement between Bakunin and Marx over the dictatorship of the proletariat concerned the means to achieve a shared ultimate goal, a classless, egalitarian, stateless society. We all know that in the political polemic, the ideas and positions that are not argued against are in their own way as important as those that are argued against. One does not argue against the position that one's opponent does not hold, and especially where there is common ground. For example, in polemicizing against black liberals and leftist radicals in the U.S., we do not refute the false notion expounded by some right-wing racists that blacks are inferior to whites. In 1918-20, Lenin and Trotsky each wrote book-length polemics against Kautsky. Nowhere in either the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky or Terrorism and Communism do they argue against the position that a communist society in the Marxist sense is utopian, since Kautsky did not hold such a position. Let's fast forward to the late 1930s, when the international communist movement had become completely Stalinized. Specifically, let's consider the young Maxime Rodinson, a French Jewish intellectual who later became a prominent left-wing scholar on the Near East and Islamic society. In a 1981 essay, Self-Criticism, he recalled the mindset that caused him to join the French Communist Party in 1937. He left in 1958. Quote, "Adherence to communism entailed, and still entails, commitment to a struggle that is supposed to enable humanity to accomplish an essential and eminently beneficial leap, to put an end to a system that permanently produces poverty and crime, that subjugates and condemns millions of people throughout the world to an atrocious life or even to death. The intent is to create a liberated humanity in which all can blossom to the full extent of their best potential, in which the collective of free beings will control the administration of things and will lay down the minimum of rules indispensable for harmonizing relations among human beings." Cult, Ghetto, and State, The Persistence of the Jewish Question, 1983. As an intellectual, Rodinson could articulate the liberating goals of Marxism better than many of the millions of young workers who joined the communist parties in France and Italy and India and Vietnam and elsewhere during the Stalin era. Nevertheless, many of these workers, not all to be sure, were also motivated by a future vision of all-sided social liberation. They did not view the communist parties only as political agencies to defend and further their economic and other social, for example, national interests within the existing capitalist imperialist system. In general, politically advanced workers and leftist intellectuals who supported the mass social democratic parties did not share the Marxist conception of a genuinely communist society. But they, too, aspired to a radically different and better society than their own. In 1961, the left social democratic British intellectual Ralph Miliband published a book highly critical of the Labour Party titled Parliamentary Socialism, a study in the politics of labor. The book came out in the immediate aftermath of a failed attempt by the party's right-wing leaders to scrap Clause 4 of Labour's 1918 Constitution. Clause 4 was generally seen as Labour's maximal program, quote, to secure for workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. End quote. In describing the Battle of Clause 4 in 1959-60, Miliband wrote, quote, in the face of the violent resistance by the party's working class base, this encountered, the proposal had to be dropped. By 1980s, no one would still have used the term parliamentary socialism to encapsulate the program or an official doctrine of the British Labour Party. In 1995, Clause 4 was dropped from the party's former program at a special conference, despite opposition from some of the big unions. In the early to mid-1960s, there was a leftward radicalization among student youth and some older intellectuals in the U.S. One institutionalized expression of this was the annual Socialist Scholars Conference in New York City. In 1966, the organizers of the conference invited Marxist historian Isaac Deutscher to give a presentation on, quote, socialist man. At the time, the cultural and psychological character of a truly socialist society, how people would think and act, was a matter of intense interest among young leftist intellectuals, not only in the U.S., but throughout the world. For example, in the early 1960s, Che Guevara was writing about eliminating alienated labor in socialist Cuba. For a retrospective analysis of Che Guevara's thoughts on this question, see Radical Egalitarian Stalinist at Postmortem. In his presentation on Socialist Man, Deutscher addressed a number of issues that the post-Soviet generation of leftist activists did not think about at all. Huntington versus Fukuyama revisited. My thinking about the death of communism and the ideological conditions of the post-Soviet world was initially mainly developed in the course of an informal discussion with Norden between 1991 and his departure from our organization in 1996. As previously noted, Norden identified the death of communism primarily as an expression of American triumphalism. Thus, he often linked the term to George Bush's formula of a New World Order, proclaimed at the time of the 1991 Gulf War against Iraq. Norden believed that the recognition by the main body of our tendencies leadership that the character of the post-Soviet period was marked by a historic retrogression in the political consciousness of the working class internationally was a capitulation to the pressures of the American imperialist triumphalism. Norden's approach to this question was influenced by the views of a right-wing, then neoconservative American intellectual, Francis Fukuyama, who declared that the collapse of the Soviet bloc signaled the, quote, end of history, end quote. An oversimplified version of Fukuyama's end of history thesis became widely known among what can be called the educated American public, the kind of people who subscribe to the New York Review of Books and occasionally read Foreign Affairs. I don't know if Norden actually read Fukuyama. I did. I also read those right-of-center American bourgeois ideologues, notably Samuel P. Huntington and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who strongly disagreed with Fukuyama's rosy version of the post-Soviet world. I'm reviewing this debate because it's useful in understanding the relationship of the death of communism to the various currents of post-Soviet bourgeois ideology, especially in, but not limited to, the Western capitalist countries. Fukuyama took the term and the concept of the end of history from German philosopher Georg Hegel,